All right, welcome everybody to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Apologies for yesterday. I had the time wrong for the conversation with Pramila Madison and on the Care book, which I'm really looking forward to. So we had to reschedule that for Thursday. And there's kind of a funny story about it. Maybe I'll talk about it in my therapy session with Lara Shihai tomorrow. But um, anyway, by that I mean the live one we'll do tomorrow. Um, and yeah, so had to move some things around there, and then for a moment yesterday, I thought that this one wasn't going to work too because I hadn't confirmed the time properly with Steve. And anyway, great to be here with you all again to be in conversation. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Um, People know, I would hope by now, but Stephen Salaita is an award-winning scholar, writer, and activist. He is the author of 10 books, including his two most recent books, An Honest Living, a memoir of particular itineraries, and Daughter, Son, Assassin. We have episodes talking with Steve about both of those books, as well as one other one that we did early, back in either late October, early November. And so, anyways, great to be with you all this morning. And glad to be back with you. And Steve, why don't I just welcome you so that I don't keep mumbling at the in the intro. It's good to be with you again, friend.
Hi, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
All right. Now let me pull up my questions. Sorry, folks, I'm not on top of my game today. So first, we're here. We're gonna talk about this piece that you wrote. Um, I think it's "Down with the Zionist Entity, Long Live the Zionist Entity" is the title of it. It's up on your website, stevesalaita.com. Um, it's the link of that is, of course, in the show notes. I encourage people to read it if they haven't already. I should also say it's been, and we'll talk about this probably a little bit more, but Writers Against the War on Gaza also created a style guide, or started their style guide, and included this some aspects of this piece in that. So um, anyway, I'm looking forward to this conversation. It's something that we started to talk about a little bit last time, which was kind of this hand wringing that we were seeing about terms, that we were seeing these pieces about the language that pro-Palestinian protesters, Palestinians use, and as well as other protesters who are in solidarity. Um, and I mean, as you point out, like probably the biggest aspect of this has been From the River to the Sea, which has really undergone an attack. Um, but we want to start just talking about the term, the Zionist entity, or placing Israel in quotes, right? And these are things that have become much more commonplace, I think, within the last 8 months. I still don't think there's anything like, this is not a huge these are not popular terms still, but they have been gained more resonance. Um, and so, I had encountered them prior, but um, the thing about them too is that I'm conscious that even when I refer to Israel now, right, and I don't put it in quotes or something like that, it makes me a little bit self-conscious that there is some normalization that's involved in that expression for folks. It it in a certain way legitimizes Israel as a nation state, as a part of the kind of world order. And so, obviously, last time we talked a little bit about some of the policing of the language of protesters, and that's usually couched in, as you kind of mentioned in the article, this like, we agree with your cause, we have your best intentions at heart, but we think you need to craft a broad appeal, and you're not doing it right. You're pushing people away with this language. And so, anyways, just say a little bit about specifically what inspired you to think about writing this piece.
Just a lot of maybe not a lot, but a decent amount of, sort of pedantry, online, that I had witnessed, didn't get myself involved in, but I saw people complaining about, the Zionist entity and just the way that we refer to Israel, and then really attaching it to all of the hullabaloo around from the river to the sea, the slogan, and the way that even supposed allies, we're sort of lecturing to to student demonstrators and everybody else, to soften their language and to make it more attractive, let's say, to a mainstream audience. And so I started putting it all together and thinking, I wanted to write a defense, of those terms, whatever problems that I have with them, or whatever else I might think about them, or in what context I choose to deploy them. I wanted to write a defense of them because a the language that we use to protest against genocide is not the determining factor, in whether you're this imaginary mainstream audience is going to continue supporting the genocide or not, or whether they're going to take the side of the victim or the genocide heir. They still deciding. They already took the side of the genocide heir. There's no decision to make. If the decision hasn't been made before you've consciously produced it, then you've taken you're on the side of the genocide. But I don't. I guess what I wanted to get at, and maybe I'll do a better job of explaining it here, is that if you are even bringing up these questions in this moment, after the murder of tens of thousands of innocent people, after all the images we've seen, after the torture, the destruction of in entire cities, you're worried about what language we use. You're a fucking Zionist. There's no getting around it. All right. I don't care how you self-identify. You're acting as a Zionist. So anybody who brings up the, "Well, we shouldn't use this language, we shouldn't use that language," is automatically sus. Period. You know, mm-mm. Like, you're going in the untrustworthy category, and I guess that's really what I wanted to sort of put forward, that all this shit is going on, and this is what you care about. This is what has your attention. This is what you choose to do. And I'd say that people weren't even doing it with you know, uh, like slogans and like kind of arcane terminologies. They were doing it ever from the beginning to people in Gaza. You know, I remember distinctly that there was a point where people were policing, Rifat, our beloved martyr. When he was still alive, God rest his soul, and tweeting, I don't like the language he's used. You know, you know, this is what you choose to worry about. This is what's on your mind. This is, and I want people to understand that coming at this issue, right, this issue of you know uh, Zionist colonization and now Zionist genocide, as a Palestinian, that not only do we have to fight against tremendous institutional forces, but everybody is constantly telling us, to eat shit, behave this way, don't behave this way, say this, don't say this. It's like everybody feels like they have carte blanche to civilize us. And it's been going on for as long as we've been raising our voices in North America and in the West more generally. And it's tiresome, and I can't help but connecting this policing of language, or let's not even say policing because that's provocative. This unwanted advice giving, you know, the rhetorical magnanimity that they're providing us, all right, whatever, that we can't help but connect it to this very long tradition of people, supposedly well-meaning, always telling us how we need to make ourselves look presentable. And we're sick of this shit. We're getting slaughtered by the thousand, and nobody wants to look presentable. We want this shit to end, and we're going to speak the way that we want to speak. We're not always going to agree with one another about what language to use, and that's fine. About what terminologies to deploy, that's fine as well. We're allowed to argue with one another, but just basically we're not pulling these terms out of our ass, that they have a usage, they have a tradition, that we didn't just discover that there's a complexity to the language and to the rhetoric when you random Twitter dude came along, right, and introduced us. See, we know, some of these terms are 75, 80, 90, 100 years old. Like, we know their problems, we know the you don't. Uh, you don't even know shit about the terms. So, what, why don't you shut up, pick up a book, learn a little bit about it, right? And then you can come into to conversation. No, 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 actually that's being too nice. No, no, just stop at the shutting up part, and just stay with. Nobody wants to have this debate now. And so that just the way that people keep picking at what the movement is not doing right, to me just screams of a Zionist sensibility. I mean, I could be wrong, but that's how it registers in my mind, and I know I'm not alone in that.
I appreciate that. And it kinda makes me wanna not ask any of my questions because, like, you've already sort of said, like, we don't even need to dig into some that's really,
No, no, no.
so
Let's dig. Let's
no,
dig.
no, no, I know, I'm kidding, I'm in jest, but, like, honestly,
Okay.
you make a very good point, right? Like, what first of before we go further, I think it's important to say what you just said, which is that all of this is really besides the point, I mean, that, like, and for you to be focused on this is, shows a lot about where your mind's at, where your heart's at, where you are in the struggle at this point to be wasting time on policing language. So, granted, that's a good I just wanna put that note because we are gonna be talking about language here today, but I appreciate that, I think that you're right on in that. So, having said that, I do wanna talk a little bit about
Okay.
kind of the term, the Zionist entity. It has a history, as you write in the piece, as you have mentioned, um and I know your piece is not giving a history of the term, and I don't expect you to do, a full history of it here. Including in the piece, you mentioned that it, obviously has a long history in Arabic, and I think that's a really important thing for people to understand too, is that is and it's an attempt to translate an Arabic term into English. Um, and including you write in the piece that it has some misuse in your view historically. So, we're not looking for anything exhaustive here, but just based on some of the things of that history, maybe you could say a little bit about first, like why it emerged, and a little bit about why you think it's come up in English lately, which you address a bit in the piece.
Mm. Well, I actually don't know the specific etymology of that term. Um, I know that it gained in popularity in Arabic, in the Arab world, really with the rise of armed resistance in the post 1967 war. And so by the 1970s it was common and it was widespread. I'm sure somebody has done in English a good analysis of the term's origins, but I don't know who actually coined it or in what decade it was first used. But I know that by the 1970s, it was pretty much one of the standard terms that would be used to describe what we call what the West calls Israel. And it's really it's a term that goes along with I guess the public sentiment that it's a term that manages to sort of synthesize a broader attitude of rejectionism for Israel that was very strong in the Arab world at the time and still remains strong among the peoples of the Arab world, if not all of the governments. It was a term, speaking of, that would be used by by government officials, which is kind of unthinkable today. I just don't think that it would land well, and that the leaders of various Arab or Arab majority countries are disposed to being provocative in that way. But I also should say, that it comes to my mind. I don't think that the term is simply used as a provocation. I think in the West, in English, it's read as a provocation, and I think that's where a lot of the opposition comes from. This is a provocation. It's needless. You're turning people's ears off. Nobody's going to listen as soon as they hear you see a term like that because they feel like that you're not being serious, that you're being provocative. But the term is not just a provocation. The term is descriptive, right? And it's descriptive in a particular way and in a way that's very important to Arabs, Palestinians especially, who reject the existence of Israel. That we're not going to call it by name. We're not going to dignify it by giving it a name. And so this, we're not going to concede that this place, this entity, if you will, has a permanent position, a permanent place among us, that we feel like we came before it and that we're going to survive and continue to exist after it. So it speaks to a kind of impermanence. But I think that in 2024, if you use the term anywhere in the Arab world, in either Arabic or English, nobody bats an eye because they're used to hearing it. They might not agree with the sentiment behind it. I mean, they probably do, but they might not. They might use an entirely different language. They might think of the Zionist entity as arcane, whatever. But nobody's going to raise an eyebrow. Nobody's going to care because it's a term that they're used to. So it's ingrained really in kind of the political vocabulary of the Arab world, and it has been for some 50 or 60 years, possibly even going before that. And part of the you know I guess tension around the term in English in the United States is the fact that there is no appreciable history of the usage of that term, and so it can sound a little bit awkward to an American's ears. But obviously, I don't think that they should jump in then and say that we should quit using the term, or quit using other slogans that have purchase in Arabic and that have histories in Arabic, because I think part of our attempt in deploying these vocabularies is not just to be defiant, right, and to stubbornly make a point that you know we're going to speak the way we want to speak. It's more than that. It's that there's a certain sensibility, a certain set of attitudes behind these terminologies that we want to introduce into the North American landscape, because we feel like those sensibilities and those attitudes are very important to understanding the history of Palestine and the present of Palestine, and particularly of Palestine solidarity work. That, you know, can I go on a little aside, a little tirade? I remember
Please.
our
Tirades are
um,
already always welcome.
oh, thank you. I hope it's not a tirade so much as maybe little wandering. But I was seeing the discourse a few months ago, and our comrades over at Good Shepherd and Good Shepherd Collective, which I want to say is based in Beit Sahur in Palestine. I know they're somewhere in Palestine, in the West Bank, but wonderful people doing wonderful work. But and others were, you know, um, somebody who goes by the Twitter handle. I don't know if it's his actual name or if it's just an alias. Saeed Jadan and others were, sort of calling out the what you might call the. I know this is an oxymoron. The mainstream anti-Zionist, sort of groups as being low key Zionist. They were talking about if not now, and JVP and Jewish Voice for Peace and others, 972 magazine, and these sorts of things. And there was a lot of response. I remember, people. I was reading a lot of people, a lot of non-Palestinian anti-Zionists that I know and like and respect were like, "What the fuck?" You know, if these people are Zionists, then the term Zionist you know, it has no meaning anymore, right? And you see that when people call like Jamal Bowman or AOC or others, Zionists. People will say, "Well, Zionist, doesn't mean anything anymore. What are you talking about?" And I realized that I was sort of browsing these responses from very smart, people I respect very much. People who are truly for Palestine's liberation. They're non-Palestinian again. I realized like it's a problem of sensibility because I like, for me, I look at this like this stuff that if not now, puts out and then these sorts of groups and 972 and that shit screams Zionism to me. You know what I mean? Like and so when Palestinians pointed out and the response in the West is like, well, these guys are crazy. Like, what do you mean Zionists? These are, devoted anti-Zionists. I'm just like, no, we have a way, like I don't even know how to describe it, right? I hope somebody comes in, the discussion or the Q&A or whatever, and does a much better job than I can. But like, I don't know, I can just spot Zionism, man. I don't know what to tell you. I can spot that shit from 10 miles away. And I know there are a bunch of freak ass reactionaries, like right now, saying, "Oh, we know what he means by Zion." No, I'm talking Zionists. Any religion. I can spot a Muslim ass Zionist. I can spot a Jewish Zionist. I can spot a Christian ass Zionist. Spot an atheist Zionist. I have spotted atheist Zionists. They're called Richard Dawkins, right? They're called Christopher Hitchens. Like I spotted their asses a long time ago. I was writing back about them, in my book, The Uncultured Wars. I think it has a publication date of 2009. I was calling out their Zionism. I could spot Zionism, and not just me, everybody in all the Palestinians in the Palestine solidarity community, they just know, you know. So when Good Shepherd calls it out, when Saeed and others call it out, because there are some accounts who make it their business to sort of call out, what they see as the low key or the tacit Zionism, and they're doing important work, right? And then everybody else, are supposed, comrades and allies, react with incredulity, then there's a problem. It, and I guess this is a long way of saying that this is what I'm getting at when I suggest the introduction of this language, because it's not just introducing a language, a different way of talking, right? These aren't dictionary debates. We're trying to introduce an attitude and a sensibility as well. And it's at the level of attitude and sensibility where I think that there still is, a considerable discrepancy between Palestinian members, or let's say Arab more broadly, members of the Palestine solidarity community and the non-Palestinian or non-Arab members of the Palestine solidarity community. There are just certain things that they don't see in quite the same way that we see, or that they don't always see in quite the same way that we see. But it's the way that we talk when we're around each other. So I'll be with a group of Palestinians, Palestinian Americans, whatever, and we'll just be like, yeah, that motherfucker's a Zionist, man. I could just tell. And everybody will nod their head. Okay. So we're seeing something that you're not seeing. Uh, Maybe the discrepancies of language will bridge that gap, and maybe they won't. I don't know. But maybe introducing linguistic and political elements into this space here in the West, for us, this diasporic space, and for you, this settler colonial space, will give us a better opportunity to shift your attitude in such a way where maybe you can see, the histories that we're trying to recall, by using the words that we use. Thank you for letting me digress.
No, I that's great. I appreciate it a lot. And I mean, just on a formal level, right? Also, it bears, I think, some mentioning, although, like, fuck these institutions, but uh like the UN, like UN member states, like there's a ton of them. There's like almost 30 that don't recognize the quote so-called state of Israel, right? And so that's fairly unusual in terms of states that are considered member states within the UN, that you would have that many states that don't recognize it. And at this point, it's we are likely to reach a moment soon where more states now recognize Palestine than recognize the state of Israel. And of course the US does not, right? And so it's also this thing too of like the hypocrisy also of the West of you know, I mean, we're talking about something that is still quite contested on the international terrain, especially in the region, right? Because a good portion of those states that don't formally recognize the so-called
Yeah.
state of Israel are, of course, in the region. Um, but I think that also speaks to the kind of, like you say, the attitude around it as well, because even though some of those states don't formally recognize it in the region, they do business or they kind of work through, mediaries. And so there is a normalization that goes along at a kind of nation state level. Obviously, I mean, we've seen that in terms of the lack of, the Arab League, for instance, having like a really firm response to this genocide. There's a lot of rhetoric that comes out, but there's less in terms of, we're all gonna boycott and cut off relations and all of these things. And so some of it is but they have to at some point balance that, because their populations, deeply look at the Zionist entity as this imposition, in the region, as this outside settler colonial garrison state, kind of apparatus that shouldn't be there, right? And so yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So I'm gonna read a quick section here. So I just first of all, everybody should read the piece. Steve, your writing is always like, as your discussion is like, you're able to hit the right political notes, but also your sense of humor always, catches me, as well as just your, I don't know, you cut through the bullshit. So I just appreciate it. So you say, I don't want to hear anything about appealing to a neutral audience either. The quote unquote average Joe or fence sitter or whatever is nothing but a convenient myth. He doesn't exist. He is a bugaboo invoked as a pretext for dissimulation. Keep digging, and you'll find that the lectures about appealing to an everyday man are fundamentally racist. This mythical creature to whom we must appeal isn't disembodied. He has a physiology, an identity, a nationality, an economic class. He already has a politics as well. He is a cipher for the unstated tenets of U.S. exceptionalism that underlie notions of mature and pragmatic communication. This creature must be identified, appeased, gratified, or else we forfeit access to the public sphere. When the creature comes up in conversation, we're not being invited into dialogue, we're being told to stand down, end quote. And so, I think that I, you know, I do obviously think that language is important. I think narratives are important.
Yeah.
But this kind of policing of slogans and terms actually, I think, always seeks to attack language that drives, that's kind of effectively communicating political stakes, or like actually is touching on something that they want excised out of the mainstream, right? They
Exactly.
don't want this getting into the mainstream, and so they go on the attack again. And this is another example. It's not a Palestinian example, but I think a little bit about how when defund the police became a demand, and people had a variety of positions on this, right? Like there are plenty of
Mhm.
abolitionists and stuff like that who were like, no, I don't like this. We shouldn't do it. We don't think that this works as a process of actually holding police accountable because they'll just give them more money and all this stuff. And, some of that I think bears reflection because that's kind of what's happened. Um, but at the very least, what it did linguistically, right, is it named a central problem that,
Yes.
you know, police killing people was a problem of policing. It was a problem of police themselves and the unaccountable support, the dumping of money into these institutions, rather than this idea that we just need to train them a little better. We need to, you know, we need to get them some implicit bias training and some multiculturalism and give them some body cameras, and all of this thing would just resolve itself, right? Which is the way that for many years folks were told these are the things that you want, right? These are the demands, the reforms that you want. And so there was a whole bunch of media, like psychological warfare, I think, about it, then about what does the word defund actually mean? It tried to convince people that it wasn't actually about money, or it wasn't about defunding, right? Or um and anyways, I realize again it's like a different slogan and movement, but the point is that when they start attacking these things, I do think that there is something there about the the slogan actually names the problem, or that there's a precision there that they don't want allowed or to maintain itself in the discourse. So anyway, think what are your reflections on kind of what I said there?
Yeah, agree completely, and I think it's really well said, and I appreciate the way that you articulated the stakes. The There's always an ideological choice being made, through diction. There's always a message being communicated, explicitly and tacitly through our choices of language and vocabulary. So all of that is true. You know, some people are more aware of that reality than others. But if you're serious about conveying uh, a distinct politics through word choices, then you simply have to be prepared to offend, uh, you know, certain demographics in society, or even to alienate certain demographics in society. And I know that that cuts against, political common sense. That no, 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 you can never alienate anybody. You want to bring as many people into your movement as possible. And while in the abstract that's true, in reality that's not necessarily true. Take the issue of appealing, to the so-called everyman, right? As I tried to demonstrate in the article, and I didn't really get a chance to articulate it in the article because the article's written in the style of an op-ed and not a long form analysis. But the everyman is already embodied, is already staked into an ethnicity, into a social class, into a location, right? When you think of the everyman, all right, this person has qualities. I mean, think about it. This person has a gender, you know. It's your sort of white, middle of the road Christian American. You could say, "Oh, no, 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 that's not what I picture." Fine, congratulations. All right, that's what almost everybody else is picturing. All right, and we're picturing that because of 200 years of discourse, by the way, maybe 500 years of discourse. All right, because listen, I have never. I pay attention to shit. All right, meaning that as the kids say, I'm extremely online. I have rarely heard anybody express concern to the Palestine solidarity movement about, you know, appealing to black people, you know, or appealing to migrant workers, or appealing to the working class. Never. So when we're always getting lectured about, appealing to appealing to, to the average Joe. Who is the average Joe? Right? The average Joe is at least middle class, if not upper class. The average Joe is white. The average Joe is a complete normie. And the average Joe has already made his decision. The average Joe already hates your ass. So maybe we should start appealing to the more, disreputable aspects of, American society, right? Maybe that's the way to go. I don't know. I'm not a political strategist, but it certainly seems worth looking into because, you know, nobody ever says, all of these PhDs and, these decorated activists. They say, well, what's the black radical community going to think if you stop using the Zionist entity, right? Are they going to think that you're a bunch of wimps and chicken shits and sellouts? Nobody ever says that, right? Nobody ever says, what are the revolutionary movements in the global South going to think, right? If you start making all of these linguistic concessions that make you sound like you belong on C-SPAN, no, nobody ever worries about that, do they? That's the point, that it's not just our language and our you know vocabulary choices that are political and ideological. It's the way that we imagine our audience and who we decide that our audience is, or who we want our audience to be. All of those things are ideological and political. People keep pretending that, like, there's some neutral terrain, right? And there's some we're of the same era. You remember the old video game Punch Out, right?
Hell
It
yeah.
was, that was the shit, man, when I was like,
Yeah.
12 or 13, and they had Little Mac, right? And he was like a green mesh, like the everyman is like Little Mac is just like, some mesh waiting to be colored and filled in. But no, that's that person doesn't exist. Everybody has already been colored and filled in. All right. And so we're making our choices about which among those who are colored, right, and filled in that we want to appeal to and attract and subsequently be in solidarity with. That's all. You can use whatever the language choice you want. Do whatever the fuck you want. I don't care. Well, I do care, right? But I'm not going to lecture you about it. You do what you need to do. But you know quit pretending that the terrain is neutral and that you're engaged in like some higher level of political strategy, because frankly it's fucking annoying, it's patronizing, it's bullshit, and most important, you're actually in a primitive political space, while the the people that you're lecturing about political maturity are actually thinking about these things at a higher level than you are. So, humble yourself and mind your own fucking business.
Right on. So there's one aspect of this I wanted to talk about too, in terms of who the audience is, right? Which is one of the things that we're talking about, but you also bring up in the piece. And that in this calculus that there's one group of people that is just never considered, which is Palestinians and Arab people broadly, are just generally not considered as an audience. And I appreciate you bringing this up because it's one of the things that I've become more self aware around since I've begun to do more and more work around Palestine, is that I've actually become much more conscious of how the work is perceived by folks in Palestine, Palestinian folks in the diaspora, other Arab folks, because they'll reach out to me and they'll tell me, and a lot of times I get, really great notes and appreciation. And obviously that feels meaningful. But I've also been critiqued at different times. I've gotten criticisms for having guests on that, and in some cases I didn't know what groups these people were a part of before they joined or whatever. And, they equivocate too much, or they kind of, gesture towards a kind of liberal, kind of, kind of that sort of politics. And, like I should say for our audience, like I'll never publicly, disrespect a guest. I'm too gracious to people who come on the show and give their time. And contribute to our platform, in various ways. And so I'm not going to come out and say, oh, that was a mistake to have this person on, or, engage in the comments with people and say, yeah, you're right, that was a stupid interview to do. Like, I won't do that, but I do take it into account, and I do seek to sort of honor those wishes and those perspectives, especially when I can see that they have a point, when, as you say, like, Brooke used the term smell test earlier in the chat when you were talking about your ability to suss out the Zionism, and when I realized, like, okay, this was a mistake to platform this person because they are too wishy-washy on this. They're not precise enough, and I'm not going to invite them back to have another discussion, and um so anyways, that's how that comes into play for me. But it does bring up that question of who am I doing this for? And I think we would all do a little better if we approached things this way. If we approached it, I think, I don't know if it was you or, maybe it was Laura Shihai in one of our conversations, of just say, like, and you might have said it as well. We should have these conversations as if people in Palestine that are experiencing, genocide and all of this are actually watching and paying attention to what we're saying, because often they are, or at least some of them are, right? And if not, their family members here in the diaspora, maybe. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that for me has offered a whole different approach to how I try to be accountable kind of in approaching these sort of conversations. And so, yeah, how do you approach that from your perspective? Because obviously you're writing a lot, you've written books, you approach these things, you're talking about these things. And so for you, how does that work?
I think all the time as I'm producing work about who's going to read it, who will potentially read it, who might read it, how they might react to what I'm saying, and different ways depending on the locations in the world, or their political commitments, or their personal histories or whatever. But I've never believed in the idea of a neutral audience. I think sometimes, writers like to picture a neutral audience, and it helps them write. It you know lowers the stakes a little bit, or it just it makes it more comfortable to produce the work. And it's a fine technique, but beyond using the neutral audience as a motivational device, I don't think that the neutral audience exists in reality. I think that we're always writing for somebody, and the idea of neutrality is already staked into you know ideological, ethnic, religious, cultural, class positions. So we discussed that earlier. But I'm one who likes to embrace the reality that the audience, isn't neutral, and so I like to think about who my argument, whatever it is, might resonate with, and whose sensibilities it might best represent. And in that sense, I'm my compass is always pointed in the direction of Palestine. I think also about my ancestors, about whether I'm disgracing them or doing them proud. And I think also of those who are coming after me, whether I will disgrace them or do them proud. So, but also in that that's oriented towards Palestine as well. I always make sure that, or I try anyway, not to be presumptuous. I don't want to deliver to Palestinians, especially the ones, who are undertaking the fight right now, a set of demands, implicit or otherwise. I don't want to patronize them or lecture them, but I see my role, given my location, my age and my profession, all of those things. I see my role as defending what they're saying, and So in that sense, I see myself less as a, a free agent as a writer, and more as an advocate. I'm trying to advocate for what they're saying. I'm trying to amplify what they say. I'm trying to honor what they say by, including the language and the vocabulary. So really, Palestine is always my primary audience. But in thinking about Palestine, I'm also, necessarily thinking about, the oppressor at the same time. And people might think that, there's a lot of relish involved at, saying something that is going to upset them, but that's not really part of my process. I really love it when I write anything in any genre that people can connect with, and that has meaning for them. That's the way that I connect with people. That's the way that I form relationships. And I think that writing an article and reading an article can be, an act of tremendous intimacy and connection. And I love all of that about writing and reading. But what I want for the Zionist audience that I'm picturing, because even when I'm not picturing them, I'm picturing them, right? They're the present absence in a way, or the absent presence. I want them to know that they're not dealing with morons or idiots or children, that they're dealing with somebody who's thoughtful and who's fierce and who's prepared to argue with them, right? And who's equipped to win the argument, right? Should they step into that space, and I want them to know that everything that they think about us is existentially incorrect, and so I deploy, my language, and I craft my arguments based on that in mind. Not that I want to upset them, or piss them off, or tweak them. No, it's that I want to challenge them, right? Not challenge them to be better, but challenge them in the sense of saying that, challenge their predetermined notions that we're, a bunch of barbarians crawling around our stomach, who are incapable of higher registers of thought. That I want them to know, I know you. I know you better than you'll ever know me. I know you better than you know yourself. And it's a fact. I do. I know you better than you know yourself. I know what you're thinking. Right? I know what motivates you. Right? I'm on to your ideology. I'm on to your way of thought. I want you to know that I understand you on a fundamental level. And here I'm going to unpack what it is that you're saying and doing, and what motivates you. I'm going to write it out, and then so you can pick it up and read it and learn a little something about yourself. You know, that's the way that I want to challenge them, and it's that kind of challenge that enrages them more than anything. Right? Is when you get a read on the oppressor. Right? The oppressor always reacts very violently in any case, and that's how it always is through history. Black people know white people, right? Way better than white people are ever going to know black people. On and on and on, in any sort of oppressor oppressed dynamic. The oppressed is going to know the oppressor more. And so, in a sense, those are my dual audiences. The Palestine. Wanted to say that, I'm trying my best to understand you, right? And to allow my readers to better understand you. And for the oppressor, it's a way of saying that I understand you already. And I'm going to sort of read back what it is that you're doing, and dare you to tell me that I'm wrong.
Right on. Folks, do drop questions in the chat if you have them, because I have a couple more, but I would love to get to, and I'm sure Steven would love to get to a couple of yours as well. And let us know what you think and what questions you have based on this conversation. And so, um, as I noted in the intro, Writers Against the War on Gaza, which is an organization, one of their projects people might be most familiar with is the New York War Crimes publication that they put out. Um, and so they took your piece and they incorporated it into what they called the first edition or part one or something of their style guide, right? And um, I should say too, just as in out of respect for their piece, the title of this stream was why we say the Zionist entity. Theirs is just why we say Zionist entity, but obviously a nod to them. And um, so, do you have thoughts on groups like Writers Against the War on Gaza and kind of some of the other media and cultural efforts that have developed since October 7th? As an act of organizing and solidarity, and what kind of value do you see in that kind of work from your view?
Oh, I love them. I think they're doing tremendous work. I don't want to start, listing individuals and groups because I'm going to forget people, and I don't want to, I don't want to incidentally insult anybody by by omitting them, but to everybody in those spaces, I think it's been phenomenal. There's a kind of a cynical thread that we probably all flirt with to some degree. We're saying, well, what's the fucking point? None of this shit that we're doing is going to actually end the genocide. The only thing that's going to end the genocide is, picking up arms and going and fighting against the genocide there. And yeah, that's very crudely true. But I try to remember. I mean, because there's a lot of despair, there's a lot of depression, there's a lot of mortification, but I try to remember that we have to exist in this the spaces we're in also, you know, um, jobs to tend to, families to tend to, responsibilities to tend to. We're not all able just to to pick up and do some romantic activist adventure or even a serious activist adventure, right? That we're rooted where we're rooted, for better or worse, and we have to live. Not just for ourselves and for our communities. We have to live, on behalf of those who are being oppressed, right? And part of the way that we do that is by expressing our creativity, by fighting politically, on their behalf, on behalf of everybody who's suffering in this world, who's suffering unjustly. And so all of these you could call these creative efforts, these creative enterprises, I think in some sense are helping keep us sane and keep us alive. They're giving us a way to connect to the horror of what's happening in Gaza and Palestine, while also maintaining enough of a semblance of humanity to where we don't give in to despair altogether, because we need to see that other people are fighting. We want to fight, and we don't want to feel alone, right? We whether it's writing an article or creating a style guide or producing visual art or music or whatever, getting people together, to go on a march, writing placards, do all of these things. We don't want to feel like we're doing it alone, and so these movements, like what Writers of the War of Gaza are doing, they're not only informing us, they're not only sort of pleasing our political sensibilities, but they're keeping a sense of hope alive, and keeping the idea of freedom alive. And these are very important. You don't always have to. This is some unsolicited advice. You don't always have to measure, you know, your actions, right, based on what kind of immediate material result that they're going to produce, unless you're in Palestine, right? running arms, or picking them up, or supplying the arms to Palestinians, nothing you do, right, is going to immediately end the genocide, or liberate Palestine. So you can work with a different set of criteria, right? And understand that we're all part of this chain. And that, yes, while what we're doing here, in the US or Canada or wherever it is you are, right, Egypt, yes, it isn't necessarily as important as what the resistance fighters on the ground are doing. It's also it's still important in our own worlds, right? It's still important for creating a future in Palestine, and it's still important for creating a sense of community in the places that we have to live, the places that we have to survive, which are filled with their own forms of oppression, right? And in some cases, those forms do, you know, rise to the level of genocidal oppression too. So we all have plenty of work to do outside of Palestine, and so I think the horror has unleashed, a lot of tremendous creativity. I hate the circumstances that caused it to arise, but that's the thing about genocide. That's the thing about colonization and oppression, right? You see humans at their very worst, and then in turn you see humans at their very best, and that's what we're seeing right now with these groups. And I'm constantly in awe of, just the courage, the diligence, the intelligence, the creativity of, artists and writers and student activists and just sort of everyday professionals. They're really doing remarkable things. I'm constantly, coming across, you know, profound statements of empathy and humanity. It's yeah. So we're getting the best of humanity in addition to the worst, and for that I'm grateful, because without it I don't think any of us could survive.
Right on. So actually, PJ just has a question in the chat that I think I'm gonna sort of touch on with this next one anyway. Anyways, I had I've been thinking about this for a little while, but like actually one of the things I really love about the Zionist entity as a term, not the Zionist entity as a thing, but is the way that it like I we need this in the United States. Like we need this in Canada, and I'm sure, people, who live in other settler colonial countries, think about this too. I mean, there are examples, right? You talk about Turtle Island, for instance, which, addresses in some ways, obviously what the indigenous, thinking about the name of the island of the continent of North America. Um, and also, of course, it's aspirational too, right? You can think about it as a decolonial kind of future. But it the thing about the entity, right, is that it's a term that you can use to talk about this like settler, kind of governing body, this foreign body. It actually reminds me too of Abdul Jawad talking about intifada and saying that it's like a sloughing off. It's like a immune response basically to a foreign body, is kind of some way to think. I mean, you might be able to help me with that a little bit, but just in terms of trying to translate that concept from Arabic into English. Um, and there's also the language. I have for a long time been really interested and learned a lot from the New African tradition. And they have America KKK, right, with the three Ks in it, or just America with the K, right, just to kind of you know fuck with it a little bit, explain, it as this kind of racist, imposition. Um, but there is something I think special about the Zionist entity that I would love to see us kind of seek to generalize, particularly when we think about how unrepresentative our institutions, governments, states really are. I mean, in this moment where so many people are saying, stop sending, a majority of Americans don't want weapons sent to Israel at this point, which is an insane thing because there's a lot of normies in there, who are like, stop this. Uh, and so, they certainly, of course, don't represent and have never represented, indigenous people. Um, you know, Obviously, there's the horrendous issue of, we could talk about the history of slavery and of Black people and the denial of their sovereign choices, which the New African tradition, I think, speaks to really well, of never been allowed self-determination as a people. So I guess what I'm saying is that there is this piece within the Zionist entity as a term that denormalizes that which we should not accept, that which um, we should not normalize, right? That we should not just accept and legitimize. And I think that that as a practice is really important, and something that perhaps we've lost a little bit too much here by 300 years plus 500 years, whatever, of settler colonialism on this continent, that we've accepted so much of the kind of normalization and legitimacy of these institutions here. And connected to this, and I think this also, it opens up space for us to talk even a little bit more about what you mean about the Zionism that you can smell or suss out, or is that there is a discourse that I really appreciate among Palestinians around concepts of normalization and collaboration with Zionism, right? Um, and so how much for you does that factor into, like, how you think about these things? And I also and partly wanted to ask you this because your work has connected settler colonialist studies and indigenous studies with Palestine. And so what do you think more broadly about these concepts or problems of normalization within our language and the liberatory importance of different structures of naming and narrative?
I think it's profoundly important to consider ways to connect delegitimization of Israel to delegitimization of Canada and the United States. And so it's funny, a few weeks ago, my a friend and comrade, Jared Sachs, you know, posted on my Facebook wall. And for you kids out there, that's like dad's social media. Okay. And he was like, well, we're gonna refer to it as the Zionist entity. Can we, are we allowed to do the American entity? Or something like that. And I was like, look, you think of whatever delegitimizing term you want and count me in. It's important. We're having fun, but we're not having fun because one of the ways that, and you see this all the time, it's crazy. Like when I first started writing about, comparisons, between settler colonization in the Holy Land and North America. There were some examples, but they've really exploded. You see that the permanence, the supposed permanence of Canada and the United States is used as legitimizing factor for the supposed permanence of Israel. The Zionists themselves are always sort of recalling, well, look, might as well, start giving land back to Native Americans. Or what are you gonna, you're gonna take apart the United States? Is it illegitimate too? It killed lots of Indians, blah 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 blah. So it's very interesting that all three are sort of relying on a mutual ability to validate one another and to write history according to their own terms. And so, insofar as our language, can help unwrite, that history, or at least help us write history on our terms, right? From the terms of the colonized, from the terms of the enslaved, from the terms of the oppressed. To the degree that the language can help us do that, and can put feelings, to and put meaning to certain ideas that we have, certain sensibilities that we have, then it's profoundly important. Some of the terms are going to stick, some aren't. all of them are going to be ridiculed, as silly and immature. And indeed, they do sound silly and immature given a certain political environment. But that's the point. We're trying to move away from, or even undermine or destroy that environment altogether, right? We want to work against the environment that considers these sensibilities and their linguistic expressions to be silly or immature, 'cause they're preventing us from fully realizing our humanity. You know, they're keeping us sort of confined, as children, you know, metaphorically and politically, right? As children. So I would encourage people to in thinking about the ways that we refuse to legitimize Israel. We refuse to legitimize the Zionist entity. We should proffer that same refusal for others that settle our colonies of Australia and Canada, the United States, elsewhere, because it's all the same. It's all the same philosophical tradition, right? That they draw from to mutually reinforce one another's existence. And so we should absolutely support efforts, whether they're coming out of indigenous communities, Black community, wherever, right? To delegitimize also the authority of the United States. Nothing is permanent, right? Nothing is permanent. Say it's done, it's over. Nothing's going to change that. Well, I respectfully disagree. Some say, we've seen changes, throughout history that at their beginning stages, everybody would have considered absolutely incomprehensible. Anything is possible as long as you keep the idea alive, and you keep the idea alive in part through the language that you use.
Appreciate that. Yeah, it actually makes me think too, even of Fred Moten talking about the idea of the state of Israel's right to exist or right to defend itself as uh one as this notion that nation states actually are not things that have rights, but that their expressions in this way then become a general form of legitimation of the permanence of all nation states, when we don't we can look to history to say no, like they're not permanent structures. They haven't always been there, and some nation states are no longer exist, right? In terms of ones that have been, we could talk about Rhodesia, right?
Yeah,
And and so this recognition that we can make and unmake these things and make new things, and it doesn't, but that in that language of a right to defend itself, of a right to exist as a nation state structure, obviously, decolonized Palestine, takes it a step further to say, settler colonial especially shouldn't have, such a right. But I think even that broad discussion is important, right? Of any state or what gives these things rights? What gives them legitimacy that this should be the structure that's permanent and can always quote
exactly.
unquote defend itself against anything? Fatih, I think, said at one point, "Not at my expense," which I really, appreciate. I think we all um, should have that kind of uh, approach. I mean, we can recognize that. I think the Zionist entity has a sort of special lack of legitimacy in a number of ways, but
Mm.
so does the United States, and so does so-called Canada, and um, and we can keep going with that. And so yeah, I've appreciated that provocation as well.
Thanks. By the way, so-called Canada is not that has a nice. You might be onto something there. So-called Canada. I I don't know. That's worth thinking about. I like that one.
Right on. All right, I'm gonna pull up. I don't really see much in terms of questions in the chat. I'm gonna pull up a couple of comments, and folks, please, if you do have questions, We got a little time, I'm sure, so we could get to one or two, I'm sure, at least. Um, Somebody said that they got the cops called on them for using the phrase Nazi Zionist occupation force while loudly talking about Scotland's complicity in my own private garden in Fife or Fife. I don't know how you pronounce that. This was just, it's destabilizing the legitimacy and recognition of the apartheid regime. They want the word erased from our vocabulary ASAP. This is the Zionist entity Nader is referring to. The mainstream infantilization of student movement for using quote unquote radical language when they are well read and studied and understand the movement. I just see Hillary Clinton's stupid face. This, I think, is a really good point to bring up too, because there has been this and this always happens. I mean, this is the same, and any radical movement gets infantilized, especially when it's young people that are involved, of like, oh, they don't really understand, they don't know what they're talking about, they haven't studied enough, they're not, they need to get, grow up and mature, and these ideals will, but this has been really, I think, fascinating to watch in this case, because you have reached a point where for years people used to say, "Oh, you don't know enough about what you're talking about. You don't know enough about, Israel Palestine, right? And you need to, it's thousands of years, and you need to go back and do all of this research and da da da." And people did, people people went and they studied, and then they were like, "Wait a minute, this is much worse than I thought. Like, I need to, and so that's the kind of the irony to some extent, is I think that so many people, young people, I mean, I work in a bookstore part-time now, and people are constantly coming in and buying books and reading and studying, and learning more about the history of, Palestine. And I think that also speaks to the importance of people doing those kind of cultural projects of different kinds, whether it's
Mhm.
writing books and stuff like that, is that people are always coming to new, levels of awareness and interest, and they do then, do the work to understand what they're talking about. And so, yeah, it's particularly, yeah, Hillary Clinton's stupid face. I mean, talk about somebody who's the least qualified human being to talk to speak down to people about, their politics or whatever. I mean, God, what a horrible person.
Yeah. I infantilization is, it's something that fucking drives me crazy, because first of all, like, it's just wrong. You shouldn't do that, but it's unwarranted. Like, again, like, go back to my prior example. It's like, oh, but we have to appeal to the average Joe. I'm playing checkers. Yeah, I'm playing chess and you're playing checkers. It's like, well, you do understand that the so-called average Joe isn't disembodied, correct? Like, yeah, checkmate, motherfucker. You know what I mean? Just because, you're going with the normative position doesn't make it the more mature position. And in fact, maybe you want to step back, right? And unpack why that association gets made in the first place. Why you're always ascribing this unusual maturity to conformity. You know, does anybody beyond a second grader, believe in that shit? Do you know what I mean? It's pathetic. And but again, I don't want to affirm the comments that came through. Like, in this moment, why that's what you're choosing to do? That's shady. That's shady. That's what you're choosing to do. Kids are, getting kicked out of school. They're getting their degrees taken away from them. They're getting dragged off to jail. They're, having poison agents shot at them, and you know, you're worried about what they're saying? I don't know, man. Like, that just, like, even if I did care about that sort of shit, even if I just had to become, like a get off my lawn type, like, it would take a long time going down the list of things that come into my mind for me to, to get to that. It's just this. In the end, Ali said it on Twitter, some months ago, and I think I might have raised the same point, probably less eloquently in my article, but it's not the language that people are opposed to. It's the political purpose of the language. The language is just a pretext, and they're not opposed to insensitive language. They're opposed to liberation. The language is just an excuse. So the infantilization is an excuse for the same thing, that they need to see themselves as superior to justify the political position that they have, but they don't want to say out loud. And that's the basis of the infantilization. They need us to be children. They need us to exist under their discretion and under their supervision, even if they won't say it out loud. And that's why they come up with such ridiculous stuff about like challenging power is or refusing to conform, is an act of terrific immaturity, and so forth and so on. They're interested in maintaining their own power, and the power of the institutions and of the states from which they benefit. They can't say it out loud, but they perform that belief in the way that they choose to focus on our language and our supposed political immaturity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and again, I think that the attack of those things is again because of the precision of the politics that scares them.
Yes.
It's the like you don't have to infantilize young people if you're not threatened by kind of what they're doing, and yeah, I mean it's never. Yeah, anyway, I mean, it reveals, I think, the precarity, I've been
Yeah.
reading and, like, doing a lot of Cedric Robinson stuff lately because I went out to a conference for
Mm.
his stuff a few weeks ago, and, the racial regimes and how, in Robinson's work, it's like it's always in the times of crisis where they have to recalibrate themselves, right? And you think about also I mean, the charge of anti-Semitism, of course, has this very long history within, as this response to pro-Palestinian organizing or anti-Zionism. Um, but we're really seeing that go into a kind of overdrive in terms of all of this push around governmental policy, and the IHRA definition, you know, uh, and, yeah, I mean, this is again, like, it's they can't deal with the fundamental politics of what's happening, right? So they have to kind of try to re-articulate this racial regime, yeah, um PJ Podesta said, also thinking about how some folks say Palestine will free us all. Yeah, I'd be interested if you have thoughts on that.
Mm. I have I don't know, I have mixed feelings about it. Um, I haven't thought much about it, but the underlying sentiment I think is nice. The idea that we have a shared humanity, and Palestine is yeah, excuse me. And Palestine is one of the manifestations of that shared humanity, and that none of us, we're not free until all of us are free, that sort of thing. And I appreciate that sentiment, and I like that sentiment, but also I worry that it can sort of put or it could seem to put a burden, on Palestinians, right? And at the same time, maybe idealize, Palestinians to the point where if they don't act in a certain way, that people outside of Palestine are going to feel betrayed. I don't know if I'm making any sense. That it turns them in a sense into the idealized victims. Or I worry that it has the potential to do that. So my feelings about the that statement are, on the one hand, that it's a beautiful sentiment, and that it is sentiment I agree with, and it's a sentiment, of course, that would be expressed frequently during, let's say, the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States from the 40s to the 60s and beyond. That that black people are the guarantors of humanity's freedom, and that's a beautiful sentiment, and it's not meant to throw shade on those who are doing the struggling, but at the same time, it strikes me also as potentially like a burden, as they're trying to get themselves free first and foremost, and they don't have to put we don't have to put the weight of humanity onto their shoulders because they're already facing enough. I don't know if that makes any sense. So, I guess
It
it's
told
a philosophical proposition. I think it's a lovely sentiment, and I agree with that sentiment, but at the same time, I think that maybe you know, maybe that's also asking us to think about and do a lot at the same time. That's just me. I understand that people will have different interpretations of it.
No, I think that ambivalence around it, I share it a little bit, and I think it's like there's a lot of different iterations of this. I mean, you talked about the civil rights. There's also the notion that comes from like black feminists, black left feminism that like, you know, um, freeing the black woman will free everyone too. And, actually Fred Moten has something that he says about this too, which is something along the lines of like, there's nothing more um dehumanizing than having to represent all of humanity.
Right.
And I mean, he also said something early on when we were talking to him about, we can't let Palestine hold the whole weight of anti-colonial struggle, because it's too much to put on them. We have to renew our practices of anti-colonial, struggle. We have to figure out how do we,
It's
we speaking of all of us who seek to be in solidarity in some way. And I honestly think that is more what's intended by that term is
yeah,
the intention behind it is that people thinking like one that Palestine exposes all of the hypocrisies and the mythologies about our kind of world order, quote unquote, or the international human rights. I mean, we see these things. Um, we see, obviously it exposes all of the hypocrisies of the West, in full view. Um, and the fascism of the West. And so I do
yes,
think that there are ways in which you can talk about how central it is and why it is that this small, swath of land and the people on it expose all of these contradictions. Um, but I do think that there's absolutely embedded in within it what you are talking about, which is this way of kind of putting everything I guess in some ways it gets Olufemi Taiwo has this thing when he talks about deference politics, right? And he talks about, the problems that come about when we rather than taking positions on things ourselves, um, that we put those off on others, right? So, like, if I'm a white cis male guy that I have to bring a black woman on the show to have a position against misogyny, patriarchy, and racism, right? It's like, no, like I need to be against those things as the white cis head male. Like, like it's important for me to actually take a political stand and not to always defer. And there's a balance there, right? Because we do want to not, you could read that in a particular way. It says, well, then we could just have white males just talk about everything and then no need to have anybody else because they could take up the political mantle for everything, right? So I think that there's always got to be a balance there. But it is true that if you take either one of those things like too far, um, that yeah, you could put people that are marginalized in a position where they have to do all of the fighting and the advocacy for
yeah,
themselves in order to free
yeah,
everybody else.
yeah. Agree.
Um,
Yep.
all right. Well, I think let's see. Daruba Ben Wahad calls it a construct. I appreciate that. Shout out to Daruba as always. Um, I think that pretty much gets it. If I missed anything in the chat, I really apologize, Stephen. This was wonderful as always. Free Palestine from the river to the sea. Maybe we should say a little bit more about from the river to the sea. I don't know. Should we? Because you
Okay.
did talk in the piece about how that's been specifically attacked in kind of outlandish ways. Is there anything you want to kind of add on that note?
Yeah, From the River to the Sea shows the controversy around From the River to the Sea shows just you know manipulative all of these processes are that. Why is From the River to the Sea controversial, right? Because a bunch of disingenuous Zionists made it controversial, right? They misinterpreted it. They made it into a discourse. They got politicians talking about it. They got university presidents talking about it. They turned it into an issue. It was never an issue for us in our community. It was never controversial. And a lot of people were arguing against me on this point because I was saying in the essay, it was never controversial for us. Why the fuck are we debating it? And they're like, well, just because it wasn't controversial among you all, maybe that's a bad reflection on your community. All right, maybe it should have been controversial, or just because you interpret it in one way doesn't mean other groups have a right to interpret it in another way. Well, bullshit. We created the slogan. We get to interpret it. You don't get to interpret it for us on our behalf from a position of power, by the way. And my point was that just because it wasn't controversial, right, among the Palestine solidarity community, that doesn't mean that it's automatically right. What I was saying is it was never controversial in our community, so there's no point in joining in this stupid fucking debate that you all created in the first place. I wasn't saying that the slogan was right or wrong. I'm saying we don't need to participate in the debate. The debate is a whole bunch of bullshit from top to bottom, right? It's like the Corbyn anti-Semitism thing, right? Completely manufactured all of this stuff. So we don't need to humor that debate because that debate exists precisely to cause us harm. All right, there's no need to engage it. Just ignore it altogether. From the river to the sea, that's fine. It was always fine. All right. Yes, you can spend time trying to convince, you know, the average Joe and the fence sitter, right, that well, this is what the slogan really means, but it really reminds me a lot of, the debate over, Black Lives Matter vis-a-vis All Lives Matter. And people went to great lengths to explain, that well, no, it means Black Lives Matter also, or blah blah blah, and then people just got sick of it, and they're like, fuck you, Black Lives Matter. I don't care how it makes you feel, because you have to get to that point, and we need to get to that point also, where it's like, from the river to the sea, you know, I'm not going to go on you know, a long discourse about how that doesn't mean that we're going to take Jewish people and put them in a concentration camp, or round up Jewish people and throw them into the ocean, or why it's not a genocidal statement. There's a point of diminishing returns in trying to appeal to people because we know what it means, right? And we know that they don't know what it means, and they don't know what it means on purpose. You can't convince somebody, to interpret something differently than how they interpret it when their entire political identity is staked precisely on that misinterpretation. You just go stand in front of a brick wall and start screaming. You're going to get the same kind of results. So just use it. You know what it means. Talk about it with your own comrades and in your own community. You get to decide, whether it's effective or not, whether it's good or not, what you think it means or not. But trying to enter into the public debate and convincing people that the term is not actually dangerous, blah 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 blah. Well, actually, no, it is dangerous. Embrace it. It is dangerous. Right? They wouldn't be trying to outlaw it if they wanted. Congress wouldn't be drafting up bills trying to outlaw it if it weren't dangerous. Embrace it. You know what it means. It's fine. It's okay. We wanted to make them uncomfortable. Well, what's the purpose of it otherwise?
Right on. Yeah, and they'll just come for other terms if they win that battle anyway, too. I mean,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
there was, I think there was one. I really feel like there was a piece, and maybe we even talked about this briefly, but where somebody was really worried about free Palestine. Like, they were like, "This," the term just saying "free Palestine," like, "This could be interpreted a lot of ways. I don't know." Like, it becomes satire at some point, It's ridiculous.
Yeah,
Um, a good point here from Chidi Macha. Yes, the reason Palestine will free us is because if the U.S. loses Israel, its settler colony will lose the region and therefore lose hegemonic control of their empire. I do think that that's an important, materialist analysis to have around the why for one reason we see so much reaction and mainstream efforts to demonize people and stuff is because it is a very important settler colonial outpost to the US and to the West and to the way that capitalism is constructed currently in the region, and they don't want to lose that, right? So yeah, I think that's an important point to make for sure. All
yes.
right, I think we've covered more than enough. I again appreciate you so much, Stephen. I'm sure that we'll be in conversation again. Hopefully, I'll see you in person soon. And
Yes.
yeah, it's been great to dialogue with you again.
Oh, likewise. Thank you so much for having me and for for the audience for their questions and comments.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.